when we started organizing. The tribute will be hosted by Professor Luis Repa, and afterwards, we'll have the honor of welcoming Professor Jean-François Kervégan for a lecture of approximately 1 hour, followed by debate. Then, after a short break of about 20 minutes, we'll start the roundtable of presentations from international researchers, also followed by a debate. The last point I would like to emphasize here concerns the listeners' certificates. We will send you on the chat from YouTube a Google form with the names of the registered listeners who should sign it the 3 days of the event, in order to receive the certificate. Okay. However, I would like to remind everyone that apart from the conference of Professor Luca Iterati tomorrow, the second and the third day of the event will have the lectures and communications tables held in Portuguese. Even so, despite the language difficult, we would like to invite all international participants to attend the other days. Okay, so having said this, I give the word to Professor Luis Repa.
Thank you, Paulo. Good afternoon to all of you. It's a pleasure to have your presence at this conference. I would like to read some words in memoriam of Marcus Müller. On September, I believe Paulo will display the text. I believe it's better to follow my reading. So I start again. On September 15th, 2020, the Brazilian philosophical community received the sorrowful news of Professor Marcus Lutz Müller's passing, one of our most significant representatives of the research in philosophy in general, in particular of the reflections on the Hegelian philosophy. The organizing committee of this colloquium, which celebrates the 250 years of Hegel's birth, and to which the professor was invited from the very first moment, could not renounce to dedicate the opening speech to the work and the person of Marcus Müller. First of all, it should be said that paying a tribute to the professor is not an easy task. This is due not to the fact that the other organizers of the event, all of them young students, and myself only had occasional contact with him. As brief or as sporadic the interaction with Marcus Müller might have been, it seems that all of us share the same experience, as the many different homages paid to him have proved since his passing. And this experience cannot easily be translated in a tribute speech. I refer to the feeling of moral, intellectual respect aroused in the personal interaction with him and in the reading of his texts, in the listening of his lectures, and in the cooperation of academic activities. The remembrance of his decisive contributions to the development of philosophy in Brazil cannot be detached from the memory of Professor Müller's own individuality. His figure expressed that element of singularity without which, on the Hegelian conception, the concept is not fulfilled as such. In this specific case, the concept of a philosophy professor. Marcus Müller combined in himself the ethical dignity of the professor and the intellectual accuracy of the researcher. The seriousness with which he wished to take part in every academic right found no exception, as well as the rigor of his theses, of his commentaries and translations. Generosity, cordiality, integrity, rigor, diligence, incentive, tenderness, admiration, gratitude, high sensibility, extraordinary competence, philosophical erudition, humbleness, verticality, lucidity, kindness. All these words are found in several testimonies given about Professor Müller, all of them looking for a way to convey the impression of personal and professional dignity provoked by his presence. Maybe his courtesy, patience, and rigor have something of his youth years dedicated to piano studies. Although he had seemed to have a promised future, Max Müller didn't make a career as a pianist. He graduated in philosophy and law at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul. According to a statement made by Guido de Almeida, his interest in music persisted even with his growing commitment to philosophical studies. This led him to the accomplishment of his thesis on Sartre's fear of negation at Heidelberg University under the supervision of Ernest Tugendhat. As the condolence note written by his colleague and friend Oswaldo Giacoia informed us, Marcus Müller joined Unicamp in December of 1975 and carried out a postdoctoral research at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales and at the Collège International de Philosophie, at the Freie Universität Berlin, at the Ruhr Universität Bochum, at the Universidade Urbino Carubó. He was the head of the philosophy department and the coordinator of the graduate program at the Philosophy and Human Science Institute of Unicamp. In his institutional context, Marcus Müller graduated many researchers, among which several became professors at the best universities of his country. It is not easy to measure Marcus Müller's philosophical legacy. His writings, spread in several journals and notebooks, have not yet found a due gathering, which would allow an overview of his work. One cannot yet establish with precision how his studies of Hegel in the sphere of the philosophy of right and the Lógica relate to his concerns with religion, especially to his interests in Eastern philosophy. This task will certainly arise in the near future. We would like to mention just two efforts that deserve the full recognition of the philosophical community. Marx Müller must be included in the extensive and complex tradition of Brazilian Marxism, especially because he wrote one of the most crucial works of the theoretical debate on the concept of dialectical exposition and method in Marx's Capital. His compelling readings about Hegel are shown to be fruitful in this general interpretation of the Marxian dialectics as a procedure of categorical reconstruction, a procedure that, I quote, presupposes the previous work of investigation of the empirical sciences and the historic maturation of the object in order to then exhibit its internal logic according to the connection that the analysis has grasped among its determinations. End of the quotation. In Marcus Müller's version, dialectics as a categorical reconstruction of the political economics becomes capable to distance itself from the Hegelian assumptions in order to reach an intent common to Hegel, the search for the maximum conclusion of the object on the basis of its simplest conceptual forms. At the same time, dialectics allows him to answer the question posed at the time by a certain Marxism that questioned the possibilities of a materialist dialectics. In his interpretation, Marcus Müller reached a double achievement. He has shown the affiliation of the Marxian concept of exposition with Hegel's, but also its difference by carefully grounding what was often only methodological suspicion at that time. Moreover, Max Müller's work has raised the translator activity to a philosophical level, a bond that unfortunately has also been weakened under the current patterns that command the academic research. His critical translation of Hegel's philosophy of right, a work of a lifetime, has no parallel. Since the early 90s, the Brazilian audience has been able to follow the development of this patient labor through the publication of successive parts of Hegel's exposition. The diligence and stringency employed in this task, under the greatest expectation, is the aha example of appreciation of the philosophical text, thus transforming the exercise of translation into an activity that combines accuracy and ingenuousness. Finally, I would like to quote the words of the real organizers of this colloquium, who, as young philosophy students, show how an individual work can always be kept alive. So I will quote my students. I tribute presupposes that there is a certain closeness between the honoring part and the honored one. Unfortunately, this is not the case with this tribute, except for a brief exchange of emails. The passing of Professor Müller leaves a void in the Brazilian Hegelian studies. As Fábio Nolasco, full of hope, recalls, he also leaves us decisive studies and the long-awaited commented translation of philosophy of right. Professor Müller had been invited by us to be one of the keynote speakers of this colloquium. In his very kind and witty mail, he told us that he felt honored by the invitation, but that, as was common knowledge, he hid from public presentations, and asked us for a few days to think about the invitation that he received with sympathy. When the philosopher Jean-Marie Gagneban, his wife, wrote to us informing of his hospitalization and later informing of his passing, we felt an enormous grief, a deep sadness. Intellectual closeness can take on dimensions as concrete as physical closeness. Although we were not students of Professor Müller, his studies and influence left their mark in the formation of each one of us. And for this reason, we would like to honor him and dedicate this colloquium to him, in memoriam. For those who are unfamiliar with his work, we will provide a list with bibliographical indications, and we hope that his presence will be, in this way, concrete for you as well. We will also send our affection of his family, friends, and colleagues. Thank you. We wish you all a great event. Thank you all for your attention. All.
Okay, Professor. Thank you very much for the kind of words. So we now have the honor of welcoming Professor Jean-François Kervégan, professor at University Paris I, Sorbonne Pantheon, for the conference entitled Hegel's Political Epistemology. After this, we'll have more or less 30 minutes for discussion. Oh, and Professor Kervégan also wrote a few words in memoriam of Professor Marx Müller.
Okay, thank you for your kind invitation to take part to this conference. So before I read my paper in English, I wish to say some words about my friend Marcus Müller, but in French. Je vais donc dire quelques mots en français parce que c'est dans cette langue que j'avais coutume de m'entretenir avec Marcus Müller. J'ai connu Marcus il y a environ 35 ans, lors de mon deuxième voyage au Brésil. Il m'avait, à cette occasion, invité à donner une conférence à Campinas et Jeanne-Marie et lui m'y avaient offert l'hospitalité. Depuis lors, nous nous sommes rencontrés à maintes reprises au Brésil ou en France. Nous nous entretenions évidemment de Hegel, mais aussi de l'état du monde qui, entre-temps, ne s'est pas franchement amélioré. Notre sujet de conversation favori était bien sûr la philosophie du droit de Hegel, que nous traduisions chacun de notre côté. Nous échangions nos expériences, en quelque sorte. Nous évoquions les difficultés de traduction, nos essais de solution, nos propositions interprétatives. Chaque fois, j'admirais la science, la précision, la rigueur et surtout la profonde honnêteté de ses remarques. Marcos ne pratiquait pas la langue de bois des hypocrites ou des vaniteux. Il n'hésitait pas à dire « Ici, il y a une difficulté que je ne parviens pas à résoudre ». C'était pour moi une leçon de modestie et j'apprenais grâce à lui à remettre en chantier mes certitudes trop rapidement acquises. J'ai, comme nous tous, un immense regret que Marcos n'ait pas pu voir le résultat de ses longues années de travail de traduction des Grundlinien. La publication prochaine, je crois, de sa traduction sera un événement scientifique. Ce sera aussi un précieux souvenir que nous garderons de lui. So I turn to my paper and I will read the paper in English. And, my English is not so excellent, sorry for that, but I try. So, in what follows, I propose an interpretation of Hegel's famous maxim in the preface of the Grundlinien: what is rational is actual, and what is actual is rational, not as usual as a politically conservative normative statement, but as an epistemological statement concerning the way in which the philosophical discourse relates to reality. My aim is to take seriously Hegel's claim that the purpose of philosophy is not to prescribe to the social world what it has to be, but to define the mode through which it may be known. What is rational is actual, and what is actual is rational. This is undoubtedly the most often quoted expression in Hegel's entire work, and also the one that had most contributed to his bad reputation. Doesn't it contain within it all the ambiguities of speculative dialectics? This is what was already suspected by one of the first readers of the Grundlinien, Nicolaus von Taden. In a letter to Hegel, von Taden presents, I quote, what was displeasing in its politics to him as a zealous disciple. There follows a long list of criticism that constitutes the first, nearly definitive version of the liberal argument against the Grundlinien. Von Taden suspects Hegel of having, out of enthusiasm for the princes, justified the reality that exists in most states, in particular in Prussia, in contradiction with the views that he had presented in the famous article of 1817 on the estate of Württemberg. Von Taden suggests that this piece, considered the most liberal of Hegel's works, might well contain Hegel's true political philosophy, meaning the only philosophy that conforms to the requirements of the system. Thus, the formula from the preface deserves special treatment. This proposition is indeed, I quote Van Taden, philosophically true, but it is also politically false, since it amounts to giving philosophical approval, Van Taden says, blessing, to the most contestable aspects of reality. For example, the repressive policy of the Prussian state in applying the Carlsbad decision after 1819. But Van Taden's letter only examines one side of the question. He explains well how the preface formula can be politically false, but he does not explain how it is philosophically true. What exactly does this equivalence of the rational and the actual mean, given the logical and systematic requirements of Hegel's philosophy? This is what I shall try to explain by showing how this proposition supposes what one could call a political epistemology. I mean, a theory of the manner in which politics, in the wide sense of the term, should be thought. Such a theory is political from the standpoint of its subject, but it is epistemological because its goal is not, I quote, to construct a state as it ought to be, but to explain, I quote Hegel, how the state, the ethical universe, should be understood. This theory is not a normative theory, at least in the first instance, since it does not prescribe practical norms to politics, but epistemological norms to political theory. First part, the real and the actual. According to the common interpretation, which appears conform to the obvious meaning of the words, the statement from the preface means what is rational is real, and what is real is rational. Such a reading leads to the most widespread understanding of Hegel's philosophy. By saying that all the real is rational, Hegel eliminates contingency and sacrifices at the same time freedom, which he nevertheless continually evokes to an implacable necessitarianism. Of course, we can note the unconscious addition of a universal quantifier that is absent from Hegel's text, all the real, as well as the omission of the other half of the sentence, which proclaims the actuality of the rational. But this does not change the nature of the problem, and the problem is Hegel's idealism. For almost everyone, Hegel remains the philosopher for whom being is nothing but the closing of the concept. From this fundamentally false position follow the other vices of such a philosophy. At first, what Rudolf Heim calls its quietism, its irresistible tendency to accord the blessing of the concept to everything that is done, including the most revolting acts. From there comes the imputation of political conservatism, often associated with a metaphysical suspicion of what is perceived as a blind necessarianism. Some interpretations, those not necessarily the strongest ones, declare the existence of a logical entailment from the tyranny of the concept to tyranny tout court. Popper offers a typical example of that mistake. In the second edition of the Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences from 1827, Hegel explicitly contests such interpretations of the dictum from the preface, whilst conceding that, I quote, these simple statements have given rise to expressions of surprise and hostility. To read him as saying that all the real is rational is to ignore the conceptual distinction established by the science of logic between Realität and Wirklichkeit. The distinction between the contingent and empirical Dasein, such as described in the first section of the Logic of Being, and the actuality, Wirklichkeit, such as presented in the third section of the Logic of Essence. And Hegel specifies, I quote, as for the term actuality, Wirklichkeit, these critics would have done well to consider the sense in which I employ it. In a detailed logic, I had treated, amongst other things, of actuality and accurately distinguished it, not only from the contingent, which after all has existence, but even from the being there, Dasein, existence, and other cognate categories, end of quote. As defined in the logic, the real is characterized both by the finitude of its qualitative determination and by the variability of its quantitative limit. Therefore, the real can always be different to what it is, even it necessarily and incessantly becomes other than it is. This is the meaning of the being nothingness becoming opening sequence of the logic. Being there, Dasein, whose Realität is a reflected expression. Being there is, I quote, being with a non-being, a mix of being itself and being other. Therefore, the Dasein suffers from an unsurmountable negativity. However, this negativity remains wrapped up, so to speak, within the massive and naive positivity of what quite simply is. I quote, logic. In reality, as quality with the accent on being there, Dasein, I have modified the excellent translation of De Giovanni's translation, because De Giovanni makes no difference between Dasein and existence. And for me, it is very important to maintain the difference. So I replace the translation in his translation, the translation of Dasein by existence, by the translation of Dasein by being there. So, quotation from the Logic of Being. In reality, as quality with the accent on being being there, Dasein. It is determinateness, and hence also negation, that is concealed. Reality only would have, therefore, the value of something positive, from which negating, restriction, lack are excluded. End of quote. Thus, reality is being there in its insurmountable contingency and factuality, but also in the misleading evidence of its presence. It is what is there, da. By contrast, actuality is, I quote, the essence that is one with its phenomenon. It is the unity become immediate of essence and existence, or of what is inner and what is outer. End of quote. This concept designates being inasmuch as it coincides with its raison d'être, its essence, or the ground of its being. Whilst in immediate being there or reality, mediation only manifests itself in the corrupting form of change, the actual, das Wirkliche, in contrast, is, I quote, exempted from passing over, from übergehen, in the sense that its exteriority, its phenomenality, or its existence as different of simple Dasein, do not presuppose any Hintergrund, any background upon which its being or meaning would depend. Reality is thus something quite different from actuality. These terms correspond to different levels of understanding of what is. It is quite possible that actuality could be entirely rational or conceptual. In contrast, the empirical reality is often not rational at all. I quote Hegel, who is not acute enough to see around him quite a lot that is not, in fact, how it ought to be. Inasmuch as simple reality is inherently unstable, variable, and unequal to itself, no doubt it cannot be provided with any coefficient of rationality. Second part, the logical status of actuality. Unsatisfied with the Encyclopedia's clarification, Rudolf Heim formulated in his book Hegel und seine Zeit, 1857, a weighty objection. The dictum from the preface, I quote Heim, crystallizes the duplicity of the whole system because through conscious play on the empirical and ideal meanings of the term wirklich, it leads either to a contradictory conclusion or to a tautological one. If the term wirklich is understood in its usual sense of empirical reality, Hegel's thesis is contradictory, for it is evident, as Hegel himself agrees, that the reality is saturated with irrationality. One might as well claim that the real is not real. But if we distinguish between Realität and Wirklichkeit, as the logic does, the maxim becomes a pure tautology. For what is the actual in Hegel's sense, if not precisely that which within the real is able to prove its rationality? The formula, what is actual is rational, then says no more than what is rational is rational. Tautology. Thus, in one case, what is insisted on is the actuality that the rational has or should have, and so the Hegelian maxim takes on a revolutionary tone. The real must conform to what the philosopher considers to be rational. In the other case, one emphasizes the rationality of the real, of the given, and one arrives at conservative conclusions. The real, such as it is, should be credited with rationality, since, as Hegel says, what is reason. In short, I quote Heim, revolutionary in its logical part, the system is conservative in its practical part. Interestingly, we can find a similar judgment by Engels some years later. Probably Engels has read the book, Heim's book. However, this assumed ambiguity gives rise to an unacceptable duplication of the concept of Wirklichkeit. There would be there would be an empirical phenomenal actuality, and there would be also a true rational actuality. Can this objection be met? The charge is that Hegel is using the same term with two distinct and incompatible significations. To avoid this charge, we should, of course, maintain the conceptual unity of Wirklichkeit. The task, then, is to do this while also recognizing the semantic thickness of Wirklichkeit. This is a familiar challenge encountered repeatedly in Hegel's thoughts, given Hegel's intention to employ terms that reproduce the processual nature of all reality, the dynamics of being itself, making full use of the lexical polyvalence afforded by natural language. The best example of this is, of course, the famous of Hegel, Hegel underlining its double meaning of to preserve and to put an end to. Hegel adds the following point, I quote him. I must strike, it's in the logic, yes. It must strike one as remarkable that a language has come to use one and the same word for two opposite meanings. For speculative thinking, it is gratifying to find words that have in themselves a speculative meaning. End of quote. Indeed, one could consider that it is the flexibility of natural languages. A word never has just one meaning, nor just one context of use, that makes them more suitable than a formalized language for expressing processuality and dialecticity. But it should be clear that mobilizing the resources of natural language is quite different from passively accepting its ambiguities. So we shall assert that there is no confusion in Hegel's text between reality and actuality, nor between the trivial meaning and the philosophical meaning of the second of these terms. What then is the status of Wirklichkeit in Hegel's logic? First, we must consider the location of its examination. Not within the doctrine of being, as it is the case with reality, but rather within the doctrine of essence. This location indicates that Wirklichkeit, unlike the simple Dasein, contains both inessentiality and essentiality, contingency and necessity, irrationality and rationality. Within actuality, Wirklichkeit, there is a distance of self from self, an active reflexivity that contrasts with the immediate coincidence with itself or with its own determinacy that is the characteristic of Dasein, of the real in its immediacy. In general, essence designates the negativity and reflexivity that are initially unnoticed but inherent to being in its apparent immediacy. I quote, is the first phrase of the second part of the logic. And then, sorry, not the first, the first paragraph. Essence is past, but timelessly past being. Essence is past, but timelessly past being. Consequently, within actuality in Hegel's sense, immediacy and mediation are co-present and co-active, as do exteriority and interiority, negativity and positivity. The actual is an immediate that carries within itself the trace of the mediation that structures it. It is an exteriority inhabited by the interiority toward which it points. It is a positive saturated with negativity. Wirklichkeit designates the processual coincidence of interiority and exteriority, whatever name they go by. They go by substance and accident, necessity and contingency, cause and effect. This process is what Hegel calls manifesting, Manifestation, or revealing, Offenbarung, where revealing is understood as the fact that essential interiority is, in and for itself, nothing but this to express itself. In contrast to the previously encountered forms of immediacy, being, existence, phenomenon, I quote, the actual in its externality and only in it is itself, end of quote. Outlining a comparison between the structures of essence and those of being, Hegel suggests that in a certain sense, actuality is the being for itself, für sich sein, of essence, just as existence and the phenomenon are its Dasein. Quote, I quote, absolute essence in this simple unity with itself has no being there, Dasein, but it must pass over into being there, for it is being in and for itself. That is to say, it differentiates the determinations which it holds in itself. Since essence is at first simple negativity, in order to give itself being there, Dasein, and then being for itself, für sich sein, it must now posit in its sphere the determinateness which it contains in principle only in itself, an sich. Within actuality, essence, so to speak, bends back upon itself or rejoins itself after having exposed itself to the risk of externality due to the duplication of essence and phenomenon. But this does not mean that the actuality has absorbed the figures of exteriority into the sphere of essence, existence, phenomenon, within a pure interiority. To the contrary, actuality is nothing but exteriority. Its interiority is exhausted in its external expression. Emerging from the initial duality of indeterminate essence and the appearance, shine, to which being is temporarily reduced with regard to essence, the process by which essence posits its determinations can be understood as a way of confronting and overcoming the dualistic temptation of the metaphysics. Understanding actuality as the essence which is one with its phenomenon requires abandoning the understanding of what is on the basis of a presupposed essential background. Actuality expresses the full coincidence of being and reason for being. What Hegel says about the necessity can be applied to actuality in general. It only is because it is. It only is because it is. The actual is absolutely without remainder. This is its dimension of externality or existence, but it is because it is. It is the raison d'être of its own being. This is its dimension of internality or reflexivity. In short, actuality, Wirklichkeit, in Hegel's sense, is some kind of causa sui. This process of constituting a surface without depth, or rather, a surface which is its own depth, operates the transition from essence as an interiority which appears in a network of external configurations to the concept as the free subject of its proper self-development, Entwicklung. Consequently, actuality, manifesting itself within itself and not within a foreign or pre-given context, is a prefiguration of the concept. In other words, the process of actuality carries out the conversion of necessity into freedom, but insofar as it still bears traces of the dualities like essence existence or essence phenomenon, whose Aufhebung it constitutes, it remains, Hegel says, on the threshold of the concept. Wirklichkeit is therefore the becoming concept of being, already mediated by the negativity of essence and only this becoming. Let's allow that, in Hegel's terminology, the rational is synonym of the concept. One can thus say, I quote, as distinct from mere phenomenon, Erscheinung, actuality, Wirklichkeit, is far from being in contrariety with reason. It is rather what is rational through and through, and what is not rational must, for that very ground, cease to be held as actual. However, the rationality of the actual awaits an explanation. The word concept is the name for this explanation. We may thus say that the analysis of Wirklichkeit, as it is carried out at the end of the objective logic, describes the access to subjectivity. Here, subjectivity is understood not as an anthropological determination of an ego, but rather as the vitality of the concept itself, this concept, I quote, which, being dialectical, breaks through its own barrier and opens itself up into objectivity, end of quote. And actuality is understood as the open field for the unfolding of an objective thinking. I quote now a passage from the Encyclopedia, paragraph 24, remark. To say that there is understanding or reason in the world is exactly what is contained in the expression objective thinking. This expression, however, has the inconvenience that thinking is usually confined to express what belongs to the mind or consciousness only, while objective is a term applied at least primarily only to the non-mental, end of quote. Objective thinking. This unusual expression designates nothing other than the immanence of thinking to the world, to actuality, Wirklichkeit, in the logical sense of the term. Through its constitution, actuality thus testifies to the congruence of the rational and the real. The identity of rational and actual proclaimed in the preface is neither a fact nor a given. It is the result of an adjustment of concept and being, a process whose fundamental constitution the logic exposes and whose concrete forms are presented by the real philosophical sciences, in particular the theory of objective spirit. This is why the 1819 course exposes the equation of rational and actual in terms of movement. I quote, what is rational becomes actual, and what is actual becomes rational, end of quote. Third part, the reason that is. Given the previous analysis of the logical background of Hegel's statement, the next question concerns its implications for moral, political, and legal philosophy, that is, following Hegel's terminology, the doctrine of objective spirit. This is a question of the relation of philosophy to actuality, which, as Hegel writes in the preface, has given rise to misunderstandings. Hegel's response to this question derives from his understanding of actuality, but it also goes a little further. I quote the preface. Since philosophy is the exploration, ergründen, of the rational, it is for that very reason the comprehension, erfassen, of the present and the actual, not the setting up of a world beyond, which exists God knows where. End of quote. This sentence highlights another consequence of the thesis of the actuality of the rational, a consequence that the rest of the preface emphasizes with a clearly polemical intent. I do not deal with this aspect here. This thesis implies a rejection of any form of normativism. It is not philosophy's task to prescribe what reality must or should be, since beyond the real or being, there is nothing apart from an incantatory, self-referential discourse. Philosophy's task is rather, I quote, to comprehend what is, for what is reason. Let's explain this sentence. What is? Of course, this expression does not designate immediate empirical Dasein, nor even the phenomenon or existence, which are always maintained as at a distance from the essence they reflect, but rather the actual, as presence and actuality of the rational. Reason, that is to say, not an abstractly normative reason claiming to teach the world how it ought to be, but rather a reason that is, I quote, the south of the world, the south that a world grants to itself, discovering itself as a vehicle of truth. But if the equation of the actual and the rational signifies nothing more than the congruence of rationality with itself, the concordance of reason as self-conscious spirit and reason as present actuality, then isn't Heim's suspicion that the Hegelian formula is a flat-out tautology justified? To answer this question, the answer to this question can be found in what Hegel says about Plato's politeia in the Grundlinien, as well as in the lectures on history of philosophy. Plato's politeia, I quote, passes as a proverbial example of an empty ideal, precisely because it excludes anyone from having free choice with regard to their social position, their sexual partner, as well as private property. These policies consciously eliminate everything claimed by the modern mankind in the name of his idea of liberty and eliminate the principle of subjective freedom. But this exclusion is not some of Plato's whims or a totalitarian fantasy. It proves that Plato had understood better than any of his contemporaries how much the principle of personal autonomy contradicted the very essence of Greek Sittlichkeit, whose purest expression is Athenian democracy. The Republic declares the incompatibility of Greek Sittlichkeit and its corresponding type of rationality, substantial rationality, with any sort of subjective self-determination. To use imagery, one could say the Republic, politeia, demonstrates the necessity of Socrates' execution and perhaps also that of Christ. For Hegel, it is thus Plato's great achievement to have anticipated, precisely in trying to eliminate it, the political impact of the emergence of subjective freedom. It is the hallmark of modern Sittlichkeit to hold that the universal cannot truly be universal unless it welcomes within itself the principle of particularity and recognizes the right of subjects to think and desire for themselves. The modern state also allows the development of a civil society that carries its unilateral principle to its logical conclusion. Plato indirectly helps us to think this. In the very same movement, he grasped, I quote, the nature of Greek ethicity, Sittlichkeit, and discerned that they were being penetrated by a deeper principle that will shake and then replace the ancient Sittlichkeit. Plato revealed the full rationality of the polis, and at the same time pointed out the historical limits of that rationality and the inscription of each rationality within history. He thus demonstrated both the rationality of the actual, the politeia is an ideal type that captures the deeper meaning of Greek historical reality, and the actuality of the rational. What Plato's philosophy prescribes was precisely, I quote, the pivot on which the impending world revolution turned. The convertibility of the rational and the actual, of reason that thinks and reason that is thus no more a tautological statement when it is grasped in the domain of objective spirit than it is in a strictly logical context. But this convertibility occurs in the form of a process or occurs in the form of a process or a history. Historically, the objective spirit, as Sittlichkeit, produces a thought image of itself, and by doing this, works toward its own transformation. Here we see how Hegel's rejection of normativism, philosophy always comes too late to tell the world how it has to be, not at all prevent the concept from having an intrinsic normative power. To the contrary, philosophy asserts that the idea, I quote, is not so important that it merely has to be and is not actual. There's a quote from paragraph 6 of the Encyclopedia. But this normativity remains immanent to the field of objectivity to which it applies. Normativity should thus no longer be conceived as the product of a subjectivity or of an intersubjectivity defined at an anthropological or transcendental level, freely disposing of its own productions. Far from the separation of Sollen and Sein, which, according to Kelsen, would be the precondition of any coherent normativity, the rational norm is actively present at the heart of the historical world, the actual, as the rose in the cross of the present. By this enigmatic sentence, we should understand the following. Within a world not yet reconciled with itself, suffering of social pathologies and contradictions, the rational is something like an indicator of the fact that the dimension of reconciliation, Versöhnung, is not only present in a potential manner, but is truly actual because it alone allows us to conceive of a future for this world. Now the fourth and last part, political philosophy as epistemology. What then does the doctrine of objective spirit as a philosophical science deal with? With the real, obviously, or rather with the actual, whose immanent rationality or concept this doctrine expresses. As clearly shown by the example of the Politeia, Plato's Politeia, this does not mean that it is a mere copy of the real. To grasp the rationality of the actual is to reveal the drive that moves the real and carries it beyond itself. It is to think the contradiction whose resolution will be the flowering of a new face of the world. The preface, the Grundlinien preface, contains some famous but enigmatic remarks on this topic. Let us highlight two assertions that, at first, appear to contradict each other. First, philosophy is its own time apprehended in South. Second, what matters is to recognize in the semblance of the temporal and transient the substance which is immanent and the eternal which is present. How can philosophy be simultaneously the daughter of its own time and the expression of a timeless, even when its object is How can philosophy be simultaneously the daughter of its own time and the expression of a timeless truth, even when its object is intrinsically historical? What exactly can a political philosophy or doctrine of objective spirit possibly speak of if it does not have a directive vocation and if its object, the state, society, is by its nature engaged in history and exposed to contingency? A passage from the preface leads towards an answer to this question. I quote, "This treatise, therefore, insofar as it deals with science of the state, shall be nothing other than an attempt to comprehend, begreifen, and present the state as something inherently rational. As a work of philosophy, it must distance itself as far as possible from any obligation to construct a state as it ought to be. Such instruction as it may contain cannot be aimed at instructing the state on how it ought to be, but rather at showing how the state as the ethical universe should be understood." Philosophy's role is not to imagine what the state and society should be. As we have seen, Hegel judges any kind of normativism to be incompatible with what has been named as presentism. This is an expression from my friend Emmanuel. Genuine thinking is always accorded with the present or the actual. But what does it mean to say that philosophy's role is to show how the state should be understood? From a standpoint like that of Heim or Carlyle's thinking, this statement is a proof of Hegel's political quietism, or to put it more brutally, is opportunism. But this statement can be understood in another manner if we take seriously the stated claim of Hegel's philosophy to be both the exploration of the rational and the comprehension of the present and the actual. Philosophy is a thinking of what is actually present. Its vocation is thus to be a rational knowledge of actuality, or rather to let actuality arrive within itself at its own figure of rationality. Yet, just as actuality is not identical to reality, the present, thought by philosophy, is not what merely happens in a contingent manner. Rather, it is the timeless presence of the rational within the temporality of the event. As Hegel says it in the introduction to the lectures on the philosophy of history, I quote, "In philosophy, we are not only faced with what has solely been or will solely be, but on the contrary, with what is, both now and eternally. We are faced with reason, and so we have quite enough to do." End of quote. This eternity of the rational, which is underlined quite provocatively at the beginning of the science of logic, has no place elsewhere out of the real. It reveals itself in the real, not as a hidden inwardness, but as a mediation that binds the real to itself, that renders it actual, recalling that actuality means the coincidence of being and reason for being, raison d'être. Despite the use in the preface to the Grundlinien of a metaphorical vocabulary that evokes the essentialist representation of a background, Hegel maintains within the theory of objective spirit the position of the science of logic, that is, that the revelation or manifestation that is a proper act of the actual in its becoming concept is not that of an other of the actual. As said in the Encyclopedia, its being there is only the manifestation of itself. What finally is the subject of political philosophy or of the doctrine of objective spirit? What means to teach how the state should be understood? It means to show the presence of what both actually structures the real and attests its internal limits. To show the presence of what both actually structures the real and attests its internal limits. To think the political, but also law, civil society, and even history as the image and actuality of reason is to measure what within its own constitution exceeds it. It is thus to think the state as self-transcending historical reality, not in the sense in which there would be an absolute, intangible, metaphysical truth beyond the state and history, but rather in the sense in which the thinking of the truth of the state and history, a truth which is never given, is that which assigns them a limit from within. Hence, political philosophy is a political epistemology. As a thinking of the rational within actuality, it indicates the insurmountable limit of every form or degree of actuality and At the same time, it identifies a share of rationality that it contains simply because it is knowledge. This limitation is anchored in a logical anteriority, paradoxically expressed as a chronological delay. Philosophy comes too late of the thinking of the world with regard to its pain. I quote, the last quote, quoting, when philosophy paints its gray in gray, a shape of life has grown old, and it cannot be rejuvenated, but only understood by the gray in gray of philosophy. The owl of Minerva begins its ride only with the falling of dusk. The conceptualization of the actuality of objective spirit only comes to pass when night falls on the real. That is precisely when one of its figures ceases to be actual. This is why this thinking is only completed in transgressing its object. That is, in revealing itself to be philosophy tout court, and not only political philosophy. That is, in my view, the ultimate meaning of Hegel's presentism. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kervégan. It was very, very good. We have some time right now to discuss some questions. We're gonna check if there are some questions from YouTube, but also we invite all the other participants here to elaborate questions, and please feel free to answer them in English or in French as you want.
It's possible that I give the answer in French because I am now tired.
Yes, we totally understand. So anyone?
We will see.
So anyone has a question? Okay, Professor Luis Repa and Federico Orsini, Professor Federico Orsini. So please, Luis Repa, feel free to start.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kervégan. I will put a question in English, but if you want, you can answer in French, okay? I tend to agree with everything you said in your proposal to think of Hegelian philosophy of law as a political epistemology. I agree with the refusal of normativism and with the attempt to think of an immanent normativity in the political structures of modernity. However, I wonder what is the phrase for ethical and political action, handle action from the point of view of those who take part in political life, and not only from the point of view of those who know political life. That is the point of view of the philosopher, or, if you want, of the social terrorist. In this sense, I would like to know if you do not consider possible a concept of action in Hegel which is capable of combining at the same time the knowledge of the institution of freedom and the conditions of free action at the same time, so that there is always a unity of theoretical reason and practical reason at the level at the level of individual and collective action. I have the impression, and would like to know from you what you think about that. I have the impression that is exactly what Axel Honneth wants to achieve with the concept of normative reconstruction. To be a fear of justice as a social analysis. Although, for me, the perspective of action also does not seem to have a strong place in Honneth. So I would like to know if you think it's possible to give a strong praise to individual action in political sense, collective and individual action, in this conception of political epistemology. Because I had the impression in your speech, the focus is on the knowledge about the institutions, but not the action inside the institutions. That's my question.
Okay, I answer now. Shall I answer the question, or we
yes,
wait?
I think you can go one by one.
Okay. Thank you, Luis, for this question. Of course, there is a theory of action in the Grundlinien, especially in the part about morality. And there is a highly disputed question today in the English spoken literature. The preface, in the contrary, is, as I read it, develops only a political epistemology that has not a theory of political action, but only a theory of what is the task of philosophy, what kind of description. I like the expression from Honneth, the Honneth expression.
Normative reconstruction.
Normative reconstruction. I mean, this expression of Honneth is a very good description of what Hegel intended in the preface. I had many discussions with Honneth on this topic, and I agree with this with that kind of reprise, development of Hegel's mode of conceptualizing the task of philosophy in general and of political or philosophy in particular. But of course, it is not incompatible with a theory of action. On that theory, I have wrote a long article about Hegel's theory of action, and I think that theory of action is fairly compatible with the epistemological perspective defined in the preface, in the sense that this theory of action presupposes a conception of the relation between, say, free choice, Willkür, freie Willkür, and that, say, the objective necessity of the ethical presuppositions of action. And there is a dialectic between action as expression of a free Willkür and the necessarily presupposed condition of that action, of this action, that is, of the structures of the Wirklichkeit. But I agree with your point.
Thank you. Federico, Orsini?
Yeah.
Hi. Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Well, Professor Kervégan, thank you very much for your thought-provoking conference. I would like to formulate two questions, if I may. The first question is, to what extent the understanding of the speculative dimension of the objective spirit, which is the dimension of the idea, turns out to be irreducible to the logic, to the purely speculative logic, and it embodies a peculiar logic, a logic that is peculiar, is immanent to the objective spirit, the spirit which reveals itself as a form of finite spirit and shows its difference with regard to the level of absolute spirit and ultimately of philosophy. So my question here would be if your notion of political epistemology does admit difference between the philosophical exposition of the actuality of objective spirit and the very standpoint of objective spirit. So the difference between the philosophy of objective spirit and the logic of the objective finite spirit, which involves a logic of action and of political action of the politicians and of the citizens, etc. So this is the kind of methodological question. And the second question is about a passage from the end of the third part of your talk, in which you mentioned the difficult topic of the reconciliation. You claim that reconciliation is a comprehension of the actuality which allows for a future of the world. So you opened up the topic of the future. So my question here would be, what's your position about the future of the historical world from a Hegelian perspective? So is it we know that this is a difficult topic because Hegel is reluctant to speak about the future. But still he has a theory of time, so he must have some notion of what the future would be like in his project of a self-critical, self-grounding modernity. So my question here would be if the future of the historical world from a Hegelian perspective is another figure of the modern world, understood rationally, or is another world, a world that is no more modern. So what's your standpoint here? Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you for your questions. At first, I try to answer the second question about Versöhnung, reconciliation, and the future of the world. You know, there is in the lecture in the introduction of the lectures on philosophy of history, an interesting remark about America. And Hegel says, America is the land of the future, and for that reason, it had no interest for us. America is probably, he means North America. America is probably the land of the future, And for that reason, America had no interest for us, because philosophy is thinking of the present, and of course, not of the empirical present, but of that proves is eternal character into the historical present. A future world or a future figure of the world. So one can answer where we don't know. We don't know, but I think that for Hegel, there is no possibility. Okay, we can have an immense discussion about that. I think that for Hegel, there is no possibility of that the future world radically differs from the actual. History goes from east to west, etc., etc., and that yes, Hegel's refused to think of a possibility of a radical transformation of the world, of the Occidental world, of the values of the European liberty. And for that reason, I tried for years to make a comparison between Hegel and Tocqueville, because we have in both cases a similar diagnostic about the present and the future of our world. To think, for example, the possibility of an, say, ecological revolution that transforms radically the figure of the world is, in my opinion, difficult. In the le cadre.
Frame of reference?
Yes, of Hegel thinking. First question, logic, if I if I have understood your question, logic of the objective spirit and logic and pure logic. There was many tryings to conceive of a logic of objective spirit as different, more rich as the logic of the logic. It was, for example, the task of not your, but the compatriot of our host, Dennis Rosenfield. He tried to explain in his doctoral thesis in France, years and years, to try that the doctrine of objective logic develops a different logic as the logic of the logic. This was true the point of Pierre-Jean Labarrière in France. I was never convinced by the arguments in this direction. And for example, in the Grundlinien, lineamenti, we found, I think, 26 references to the logic. And Hegel explicitly says, all what I develop in this treatise presupposes the logic, and the logic of the logic. For example, the concept of Wirklichkeit. For that reason, I have insisted on, I insist on the importance of the logical concept of Wirklichkeit. Without that, we can't understand the formula of the preface, and in general, the development of the doctrine of objective spirit. But of course, it is a very difficult question. There were many tentatives in Germany to describe a different logic as the logic of the logic, of the science of logic, but it never comes to positive results, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Professor, we have only 2 more questions from the chat, YouTube. Is that okay?
Can I see the questions, or? No?
Yes. Okay.
No. No.
1 second. I would read it for you if you want.
Okay.
Okay. It's from Michael Schmidt, and it goes: could this interpretation of philosophy as descriptive rather than normative be considered a form of immanent critique? And the last one from Yona Ackerman-Zieberman. It's in French. Une question proposée au professeur. Est-ce que vous pensez qu'il y a des leçons sur la épistémologie de Hegel qu'on peut appliquer dans les contextes politiques actuels? Merci. Okay, yeah, so 2 questions. Feel free to answer them.
Okay, I try to answer the first question. In my view, the task of Hegel's philosophy of objective spirit is normative. And Hegel tries to surpasses the distinction of normative and descriptive. This method is not normativistic, but is normative. I make a difference between normativistic is a standpoint, as for example that from Kelsen, that considers that normativity is closed upon itself. There is a world of norms, that's Sollen, and a world of Sein, Felfen, events, actions, etc. And there is a radical difference between the world of Sollen, of normativity, and the world of Sein. Hegel tries precisely tries to surpass that kind of differentiation of the normative and the empirical, of the factual. There is an immanent normativity of the actual, and the task of philosophy's task is to exhume that inherent, immanent normativity of the actual, not to project an external normativity on the real world. For that reason, Hegel says, my task is not to say to the world or to the state what it has to be. Only in analyzing the idea and the concept of state, we can describe a possible immanent direction of the state. I can give a very concrete example, and it is a very simple remark that one ignores often. the state, as it is described in the Grundlinien, is a constitutional state. What was the state, the Prussian state, in the time of Hegel? It was not a constitutional state. And Hegel says, okay, but the logic of the modern state is constitutionalism. There we see very concretely the difference between actual and real. The real state is not a constitutional monarchy. In the contrary, the king refuses 2 times or 3 times to give a constitution that is revolutionary, French, etc., etc., etc. But Hegel says, if we analyze this correctly, if we correctly analyze the concept of the modern state, then we must conceive of a constitutional state with different powers, etc., etc. And this is a good example for that. The other question, sorry, was the French question.
Yes, it's sur l'épistémologie de Hegel qu'on peut appliquer dans le contexte politique actuel.
Je réponds en français. Eh bien, justement, c'était un peu le sens de la question de Louis Repa tout à l'heure. Ce que, par exemple, Axel Honneth dans Das Recht der Freiheit, le droit de la liberté, essaye de faire, c'est cela, d'une certaine manière, c'est-à-dire opérer une certaine transformation des concepts hegeliens permettant de penser le monde actuel, ses pathologies spécifiques, ses souffrances spécifiques et peut-être son avenir spécifique. Je ne dis pas que c'est la seule manière de penser hegeliennement le monde actuel, mais c'est un bon exemple d'une, on va dire, d'une appropriée. Personnellement, je suis pas d'accord avec pas mal d'aspects de Honneth. J'ai écrit plusieurs choses là-dessus, mais en tout cas, c'est pas le lieu de discuter de ça. En tout cas, c'est une manière très intéressante de tenter d'appliquer en quelque sorte, mais bien sûr au prix de transformation, de modification conceptuelle, le propos de Hegel à un monde qui n'est plus celui de Hegel. Bien que Hegel ait prévu un certain nombre de transformations que nous connaissons et que lui ne connaissait pas, par exemple la globalisation, la mondialisation. Donc, il y a une esquisse de théorie de la mondialisation et des apories que cela représente pour l'État. On n'est pas sorti de ça. Comment l'État national peut-il gérer des problèmes qui ne sont pas des problèmes nationaux? On pourrait dire la même chose des questions écologiques, bien entendu. Mais là, c'est vrai qu'Hegel ne dit rien de cela. Mais ce genre de questions se pose également. Voilà. Je crois qu'il y a une question de Fabiana. J'ai vu, non?
No, I think.
Si,
Dans
le chat.
Ce sont les mêmes questions, je pense.
Ah bon, d'accord. OK, thank you.
Okay, so we are running out of of time right now. So unfortunately, we would like to continue this discussion, but we must finish it, and we will have a short break right now, 20 minutes. We thank you very much, Professor Kervégan. It was a very, very good conference and a very nice chat. Now we have a 25 minutes break so that everyone can relax a little bit and drink some water. And then we come back with the roundtable from the international researchers. Professor Kervégan, merci beaucoup.
Merci à vous. Merci à vous. And next time in São Paulo, I hope, we must hope that, we must hope the possibility.
Yeah.
Goodbye. I will heard a little the roundtable now.
Okay.
But now
Merci beaucoup.
Goodbye.
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 For break, it is 15 minutes.
20 minutes of break.
20 minutes, okay, in maximum. Okay.
We will be here waiting for you all.